Judgment Day is here, as Missile Command unleashes a nuclear hell on the VCS. Of all of Atari's arcade hits of the 70s and 80s, Missile Command may be the most locked into a specific moment of time. Here is an arcade game very clearly about nuclear annihilation designed and sold at one of the hotter points in the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, with an underlying message that nuclear conflicts simply can't be won. And while the VCS version loses some of the components of the arcade original, the core play and subtle storytelling of Missile Command comes through magnificently. Nuclear war and annihilation were recurring themes in popular media for decades by this point, from 1950s and 60s films and books like Dr. Strangelove and Planet of the Apes, to productions like War Games, which debuted in 1983. With the proverbial sword of Damocles swinging over the head of human civilization, folks had to work out those anxieties and stress through creative means. Arcade games were no exception, with electromechanical machines like Sega's Missile envisioning defending a space from encroaching enemy aircraft. So it was with Missile Command. The idea of a missile-based game had been floating around within Atari's walls for years by this point. Records from the Strong Museum of Play indicate that in 1974, Atari purchased a copy of Nutting Associates' arcade machine Missile Radar, a game about shooting down missiles that appears to only have had a very limited release, if at all. Steve Bristow has said in interviews over the years that he found it interesting and routinely pitched Atari doing their own missile game. It wasn't until Atari's vice president of sales, Gene Lipkin, spotted a piece in a magazine about satellites and radar screens and requested a game be made along those lines that it finally happened. Dave Toyer was available, having wrapped up work on the Atari soccer arcade machine, and according to the book 8-Bit Apocalypse, his boss, Steve Kelfy, showed him the magazine cutout and asked him to try and make a game that fit Lipkin's request. Toyer agreed, and alongside Rich Adam as a junior programmer, started brainstorming what this game would look like. The initial concept involved missiles from the Soviet Union streaking in from the top of the screen, and the player defending their bases by firing their own missiles back on behalf of the United States. Toyer pushed back to drop the specific belligerence from the game, believing it could come back to haunt Atari, and when the cities players must defend were added to the concept a little later, they too would have their real-world names dropped. According to Rich Adam, the cities were originally all Californian: Eureka, Los Angeles, San Diego, San Francisco, San Luis Obispo, and Santa Barbara. Toyer also insisted that the game would be purely defensive. There would be no going on offense against opposing cityscapes, ensuring players were focused entirely on survival. In his telling from 8-Bit Apocalypse, Toyer described it as a moral choice. He wanted players to feel like they were protecting their home in a time of need, defending whatever cities they believed those graphics represented, and not having to worry about the potential moral murkiness of a contextless counterattack against another city. And being both an arcade game and a message on the futility of a nuclear confrontation, it is impossible to save your cities successfully. Eventually, players would be forced to triage their resources to winnow down which cities they were defending, before ultimately losing entirely. This too was part of Toyer's theme, hoping players would, on some level, internalize the consequences of their decisions, though whether or not players picked up on this is an open question. At the conclusion of the game, and assuming the player didn't set a high score, the entire screen explodes with the stark letters, "The End," showing up. This kind of subtle political messaging showed up in other games at this time, though it was certainly not common. For example, the 1982 Bally Basic program Nuke the Expletive satirizes jingoism by putting players in charge of dropping a nuclear bomb on a city and then tallying up the death toll. If you choose not to drop the bomb, then the game chastises you. But Missile Command was certainly the highest profile, and probably the most successful game of its day to attempt this. Toyer and Adam started with the premise of players having 3 missile bases to fight back from, then adding in cities to give players something to defend other than their bases, which were then raised up to differentiate them. Enemy missiles alone were relatively easy and boring for players to deal with, so the two designers came up with satellites and planes that would drop missiles from lower altitudes, and missiles that would split into numerous warheads at a random point after entering the screen. Finally, smart cruise missiles that would actively maneuver around explosions in their way were brought in as a way to force good players into difficult situations. A trackball would be used as the main control mechanism for the game, which was a fairly rare input method for an arcade game at the time. this point, the display was still designed as a radar screen with color coding indicating the level of damage done to cities and the bases. Toyer and Adam had the idea of indicators on the marquee that would show how close missiles were to destroying cities, but in location tests they found this didn't really work. Ultimately, the finished game dropped the radar screen concept and separates out the cities into spaces that are either intact or destroyed, resulting in a fast-paced game that would be one of Atari's biggest hits of 1980. Research from historian Keith Smith suggests Atari produced about 18,000 units. The company started work on a two-player follow-up, but it doesn't appear that this ever saw full production. Atari did license the game out to Sega for Japanese distribution in its own distinctive cabinet, which included a unique speaker arrangement to add some additional depth to the game audio. Japanese coin-op trade Game Machine indicates this came out around June, the same time as the US release. Taito also seemingly licensed out Missile Command for a Japanese tabletop version, which were popular sites in cafes. In arcades, Missile Command has a trackball, 3 firing buttons, each corresponding to a missile base on screen, and 6 cities to defend. The trackball moves around the targeting reticule, and when a missile is fired, it'll make its way to that spot and explode. Any attacking force that hits that explosion explodes itself, which can lead to chain reactions. Missiles from the center base are faster than those on the periphery, but each base only holds 10 missiles, forcing players to be strategic about which they fire. If a base is hit, all its missiles are destroyed until the next wave. Every 10,000 points, players earn a new city to replace any of those that are lost, with scores multiplying every couple waves. With the intensity of attacks increasing quickly each wave, Missile Command can be a pretty quick game, but it never feels like an unfair one. As one of the premier hits of the arcade golden age, Missile Command was a popular game for high score runs. A feature article in the Havre Daily News quotes Atari spokeswoman Laurie Burgess as saying that a record for Missile Command seemingly was being broken every month, with the company mailing the new champions a certificate and a t-shirt. Even today, Missile Command is known as a high scorer's endurance run, with high scores often requiring players to operate the game for days on end, stockpiling enough bonus cities to be able to take breaks to rest, eat, and use the bathroom. Missile Command's legacy also runs through the world of unlicensed arcade game hacks with an unusual ending. In June 1981, a trio of college-age programmers in Massachusetts started selling a homemade hack of the game called Super Missile Attack, which featured faster missiles, a UFO target, and a quicker game speed. This was sold as a conversion kit for the standard Missile Command cabinet under the General Computer Corporation, or GCC, label. The idea was that Super Missile Attack would help operators improve their margins. As players got better at the original game, they could stay on the machine longer, and that cut into revenues. By making the game more difficult, operators could once again get the upper hand, and masters of the game could enjoy a new challenge. The new boards sold for about $300 a pop, which ended up netting the GCC founders a pretty good profit margin, and they started work on a conversion mod for Pac-Man called Crazy Otto to add more variety to that game. Atari was displeased and filed a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against GCC, but ultimately the two sides settled. GCC would make games for Atari under license, including arcade titles like Quantum and Food Fight. Crazy Otto would go on to be released under license by Midway as Ms. Pac-Man, becoming one of the premier arcade games of all time. And when Atari's own internal software development ranks had been thinned out by programmer exits, the company contracted with GCC to make games for the VCS, including incredible conversions of Ms. Pac-Man, Millipede, Moon Patrol, and Galaxian. GCC ultimately would go on to design the 7800 game console and develop the first tranche of games for the system, before shifting away from Atari to develop products for the Macintosh computer line. These are all storied histories for another day, but suffice it to say, without Missile Command and Super Missile Attack, GCC would likely not have become the development house it was at the time. According to an interview with him on the Antic podcast, Atari management asked developer Rob Zidabel, known previously in the series for Stellar Track, if he'd do the conversion to bring Missile Command to the VCS. Zidabel declined, not wanting to try and port it within the VCS's limitations, but he did agree to make a version for Atari's computer line. This port reduced the number of bases to 1 and, under normal circumstances, stuck players with joystick controls. But Zidabel and his friends wanted to throw in a trackball mode for their own custom-made controllers, and so one of his friends wrote some control routines that went undocumented at the time. When Atari did eventually release trackballs compatible with the VCS and computer lines, Missile Command was indeed compatible with these retail units. Zidabel added the game still had a bug in it where occasionally a city would just vanish, but he was unable to track down the cause of it before the game shipped out in early 1981. But this still left the VCS needing its own missile command. Developer Rob Fulop took up the job after Citadel declined it. In an interview with the website Paleotronic, Fulop said he and fellow developer Brad Stewart were discussing whether or not asteroids and missile command were doable on the VCS, and Stewart pitched the idea of using graphical flicker to make an asteroid filled within the system's limitations. Fulop thought that could also work for missile command, and the two decided to compete to see who could have a working display for their game running first, which Stewart reportedly won by a week. But Fulop was determined to make missile command as close to the arcade as possible, both as a huge fan of the original version, and he himself still stinging from the comments that his Space Invaders project on the Atari computer line didn't end up playing very close to the arcade game. Much as in Citadel's computer version, Fulop cut the base count down to 1, and needed to use a simple digital joystick for input. Furthermore, the VCS's limitations forced him to drop the splitting missiles, as well as the satellites and aircraft. Despite these losses, Fulop tried to include as much as possible from the arcade game's visual language, sound effects, and overall feel. On these counts, he dramatically succeeded. Missile Command on the VCS is a prime example of what made for a successful home port of an arcade game. Arcade machines routinely were more powerful than anything a normal person could afford at home, so it was important to retain the core elements of the arcade game for a home conversion to succeed. Players are still facing down waves of normal missiles, along with the smart cruise missiles that evade explosions. They still have 6 cities to defend and only 30 missiles to do so with, while additional VCS limitations restrict players to only having 3 of their missiles exploding at any given time. Coupled with the inherent hits to speed and accuracy from going from a trackball to a joystick, and players can no longer simply blanket an area of the screen with missiles to protect it. Instead, players must use the large explosions from their own missiles to hit a general region of the screen, prevent encroaching attacks from hitting their targets. The different game types adjust how quickly players' targeting reticule moves, how effective the smart missiles are at evading explosions, and what wave players start on, while the difficulty switches adjust how quickly players' missiles move after being launched. Finally, Fulop included a children's mode, with slow-moving missiles and other objects to help small kids get the hang of the game. As far as I can tell, this is the first VCS game to come out that includes game modes specifically for young children, who aren't going to have the coordination or experience to play at other difficulty settings. These would become a fairly standard sight on Atari's first-party offerings going forward, particularly for arcade ports. These games were, at this time, denoted with a teddy bear logo on the boxes, though this indicator would be dropped when Atari moved to silver labels in late 1982. While I can't fairly judge these modes as an adult, my recollection from my childhood is that they were generally effective at providing an ample challenge to a 5-year-old. And in keeping with Steve Wright's encouragement to include more Easter eggs in games after Warren Robinette's adventure secret was discovered, Fulop included his initials in the game. Players ended at game type 13 with less than 90 points on the board. RF would appear on the right side of the screen. Fulop said the difficulty with including these secrets was just cramming them into the limited space on a VCS cartridge. Missile Command initially came in at 4,500 bytes, when the cartridge size allocated to it was only 4,000, requiring some ugly code rewriting to fit the game and his initials. This seems to have been removed from later production runs, but returned during the copies manufactured in the Atari Corp years. Much like the arcade game, players are tasked with defending 6 cities from enemy attacks. Since the 3 bases have been reduced to 1, the 30 missiles players would normally be splitting up between them in the arcade version are now stockpiled in one place, with 10 being available at a given time. If the base is hit with a missile, the rest of that 10 missile stockpile will be destroyed, and you'll be stuck for a moment while the next tranche is brought up. Explosions no longer chain, but the explosion from your missiles lasts longer and takes up a bigger part of screen real estate, allowing you to essentially get the same results as you would in the arcade. The digital targeting system also works pretty well. Once players get the hang of how it moves in slower game types, it's easy to flip to a game type with a faster reticule and really pick off your targets. The cruise missile evasion routines are pretty binary, however. In some game types, they are arcade accurate, where you must more or less land the explosion on top of them, while in others they'll blindly fly right into an explosion in front of them. The different starting waves is a good way for a player to jump right in where they're comfortable, while the slow missile speed from setting the difficulty switch to A drastically changes how you have to approach the game, forcing more accurate shots fired much earlier in advance. And accuracy is the key to this game, as even though your explosions are bigger than the arcade, only having 3 on screen at a time means you can't whiff at the higher waves. This is, overall, an incredibly solid package if you enjoyed the arcade game. The game manual takes a decidedly sci-fi approach to the game, dropping the homegrown nuclear horror for a battle between the planets Kurtal and Zardon. Once again, the player is put in the role of defending their homeland, and owing to the peaceful nature of your world, there is no discussion of a counteroffensive. Fulop said he had nothing to do with this story in the manual, it having been invented whole cloth by someone else. Given the VCS market largely being kids and families, it's unsurprising that the darker themes of the arcade game would be dropped for the home version's manual. It's also arguable that this backstory makes the game a bit more timeless than the very Cold War arcade premise, but it is very much not reflected in the VCS game itself. Missile Command generated some buzz around its VCS debut, with announcements in industry trades like playthings, leisure time electronics, and merchandising. Missile Command won the Archie Award for Best Solitary Game in Electronic Games, where Bill Kunkel and Arnie Katz indicated that the granularity of its game types allow players to fine-tune the game to their personal skill level. It also was a runner-up in the magazine's Game of the Year award, losing out to Brad Stewart's Asteroids conversion. The game comes up numerous times in Electronic Games' debut issue, with a full review praising Fulop's work converting the arcade game to the VCS, and a short write-up and a feature about choosing the right game console. The magazine also indicates that, alongside Asteroids and Warlords, Missile Command is one of Atari's biggest sellers of the year, and a reason why the company was holding off on new game introductions. Whether or not this is just speculation is unclear, but Atari itself only has 2 more games lined up for release in 1981, along with a Sears-timed exclusive that wouldn't be published by Atari directly until 1982. And while Atari itself may not have been holding official competitions for Missile Command's VCS conversion, there are newspaper reports of ones that stores were running themselves. In this regard, the game seems to have fallen into Stewart's Asteroids conversion's shadow, released only a few short months later. Much like Fulop's previous VCS game Night Driver, Missile Command appears to have been one of Atari's bigger successes. An internal sales document glimpsed in the Once Upon Atari documentary puts it as Atari's 22nd best-selling VCS title, albeit cutting off the actual numbers. Thanks to internal sales figures rescued by the late Kurt Vendel, we do know that Atari Corp shipped 25,505 copies of Missile Command between 1986 and 1990. Not huge numbers in any specific year, but a steady drip between 2,000 and 9,000 copies shipping out. This is about what you'd expect from the number 22 game on the sales document, and the conversion from an increasingly old arcade game, and it is certainly a solid showing for a game in the platform's twilight years. It's also plausible that there wasn't much demand. As one of Atari's biggest arcade hits, it's plausible that there were a lot of copies working through the retail system during and after the market crash around 1983. Curiously, while Missile Command would see clones on home computers, very few obvious clones would show up on game consoles. Possibly the premise and gameplay to Missile Command was so specific that other companies didn't want to risk bringing down Atari's legal team on their heads. The Magic's Atlantis is the most unique clone, with multiple bases firing only along specific paths at enemy vessels to defend a home base. A European publisher called Video Gems also produced Missile Control for the VCS, which plays sort of like a hybrid between Atlantis and Missile Command. The Emerson Arcadia and its clones saw Missile War, which had players defending 4 cities with 2 missile bases. The fairly low number of missiles the game allots you does make this strikingly difficult to do well in, however, though it does play reasonably well otherwise. The Bally Professional Arcade, being something of a console-computer hybrid, did have a few user-created variations on Missile Command produced through its basic cartridge. But the most ambitious version was likely ICBM Attack, sold by Spectre Systems. This particular game was written in machine language and used a specialized controller that had an analog joystick. By plugging in 2 controller ports and using the spinner functionality, they were able to produce a remarkable take on the arcade game with 3 missile bases, 6 cities, and a unique attack method. Developer Brett Bilbrey remarked that each of these controllers was built by hand by him and his 3 friends included with the game. Bilbrey remembers less than 30 copies were ever produced and sold, though Marion Nalepa, another Spectre Systems member, estimated it was closer to 125. While he had plans to do more games that used the analog controller they developed, Bilbrey said it never came to pass. In 1985, ICBM Attack was hacked and re-released by Mike White with standard controller support under the name Missile Attack, with another 34 copies sold. Atari itself would revisit Missile Command on the 5200, where the analog joystick proved beneficial for aiming missiles. This version even included true trackball support, which results in a truly satisfying method of playing the game. This would be Fulop's last published game at Atari. Despite Missile Command being a big hit for the company, he said his bonus later that year ended up being a coupon for a turkey at Safeway. With his boss Dennis Coble exiting the company to start Imagic, Fulop joined him. That said, his next game, Demon Attack, would prove to be another massive hit, cementing Fulop's status as one of the premier VCS developers. While the Cold War and the circumstances behind Missile Command's creation are both in the past, the game still retains the level of interest you'd expect out of one of Atari's bigger hits. Modern programmers have hacked both Fulop's VCS game and Zidabel's 8-bit computer version, adding full analog trackball support to the former and the missing missile bases to the latter. The game has been a staple in Atari Arcade and VCS re-release packages, and Atari Corp even revisited Missile Command for its Jaguar console in the 1990s, resulting in the sequel Missile Command 3D. More recently, the game was reimagined and remade under the name Missile Command Recharged for modern platforms, which strips down its visuals to the essentials. But owing to its reliance on the standard joystick and being a wildly popular VCS, Fulop's home version arguably has become as much the standard as Toyer and Adams' arcade original. This is, without question, one of the finest games to appear on the VCS, one that can be considered among the machine's essential titles. Next time, we learn a thing or two about machine language programming.